So hello and welcome to yet another episode of Biographics. I'm your interim host, Carl Smallwood. That's Carl with a K and Smallwood with an S-M-A-L-L-W-O-O-D. And today we're talking about Charlotte Corday, the angel of assassination. And before we get onto the body of today's video, I should point out that, like with all videos here at Biographics, this one is based on a script submitted to us by a member of our writing team. That member today being Arnoldo Tyranny. Go follow him on the social links below if you are so inclined. Also, because this is a video about a French person from France and there are a lot of French words and pronunciations, I've done my best to familiarise myself with the more difficult French pronunciations, but as someone from the north of England, for the ones that I'm really not familiar with and I couldn't find any definitive pronunciation guides on, I'm just going to do what all British people do in my situation.
They just butcher it.
Affect an offensive French accent and try and muddle through. Without further ado, let's get to it though. So, it's one of the most famous works of art of the 18th century, painted by French artist Jacques-Louis David. See what I did there? Told you. And if you take a look at the painting, you'll see a man sitting in a bathtub, slumped slightly to his right. In his hands, clutched lightly the instruments of his profession and of his power. A pen and a letter. A small wound just below the right collarbone oozes blood. On the floor, we can see the murder weapon, a stained knife. The image is realistic, yet solemn. It conveys the dignity, even in death, of the man portrayed. His name was Jean-Paul Marat, a friend of the artist, later hailed as a martyr of the French Revolution. Just outside the confines of the frame, though, the drama is not over yet. A young woman has been beaten, struck with a chair, and thrown to the ground. And until that very afternoon, that woman was a young and sheltered aristocrat whose involvement with the politics of the French Revolution was limited mainly to heated drawing room discussions. Well, this afternoon, that woman has decided to take action and strike at a man who, in her eyes, represents tyranny. Her name is Charlotte Corday, later immortalised by the author Alphonse de Lamartine as a brave and gracious angel enacting God's own justice, the angel of assassination. The Daydreamer. Marie-Anne Charlotte de Corday d'Armont, which we're going to be shortening to Charlotte Corday, mainly for me, it's mainly for me, was born on the 27th of July 1768 in Écorche, Normandy, northern France. She was the third of 5 children sired by Francois and Charlotte Sr. These two just happened to be cousins, both descendants of Pierre Corneille, one of the greatest French playwrights. In spite of this remarkable ancestry, Francois was always strapped for cash. As a third-born son, he had inherited little land, but he had spent what little money he had on his children's education. The works of Corneille played a fundamental role in Charlotte's education as she admired his selfless heroes who were always willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Charlotte's dad also introduced her to the work of philosophers Montesquieu and Rousseau, which contributed to her political awareness and a propensity for progressive thoughts, at least progressive by the day's standards. From an early age, Charlotte took to daydreaming about accomplishing some spectacular deed, a feat of arms and courage fueled by abnegation, a spirit of self-sacrifice and a service to a higher ideal of truth, justice, and the French way, I suppose. If we have given the impression of a bookworm who only acted through imagination, we do apologise. In fact, Charlotte was a vivacious and active girl, almost turbulent. While she was expected to keep her fragile mother and delicate sister's company, she preferred to play outdoors with her brothers and the local peasant boys. This idyllic phase of her childhood, however, did not last long. In 1782, Charlotte Sr. died, leaving Francois in a quandary. Money was tight. Really tight, and he could not possibly look after all of his children. His only choice was to instead then entrust them to the care of a religious institution such as the Abbey of the Ladies in Caen, Normandy. Specifically, this institution was created to take care of aristocratic yet somehow destitute young ladies like Charlotte. And this is where Charlotte spent most of her formative years. Most of the education she received was of, as you probably guessed, a religious nature quite naturally. But the young Mother Superior, Cécile de Castelmoran, took Charlotte under her wing, supplying her with philosophical and political books that the girl loved ever so much. The young Corday was a guest at the Abbey until the February of 1791, shortly after the religious orders had been suppressed and all of the clergy's property nationalised. This upheaval was one of the consequences of a little event you may have heard of more than Corday, the French Revolution. And we will not get into the details of this momentous event of world history, but here are the basics. We've probably also covered it on our sister channel, Biographics. The starting date of the French Revolution is generally indicated as July 14th, 1789, when the people of Paris stormed the Bastille prison, the symbol of royal oppression. This act had been the result of a long simmering tension between the so-called Third Estate, or commoners, and other two estates, the aristocracy and the clergy. The lines were not so neatly drawn though, however. Several members of the clergy and and aristocracy and upper middle classes did sympathise with the lower rungs of the third estate and the desire for constitutional reforms. This was particularly true in the economics department, where reforms were really necessary to curb the disastrous effects of the incompetent King Louis XVI's absolute rule. The king oscillated between agreeing to a constitutional government while conspiring to crush it. The new government had reason to feel threatened, both by internal and external enemies, as monarchist sympathisers and foreign powers lined up to crush the revolution in its infancy. So despite her aristocratic origins, Charlotte Corday was sympathetic from the start with the revolutionary ideals, which she defended fiercely against more conservative fellow nuns and relatives. One of them, Frederick de Corday, would later recall her energy, independence of thought and single-mindedness, stating, and I quote, "You could not change her mind. It was useless. She never had doubts, never uncertainties. Her decisions, once taken, she no longer admitted any contradiction." After the abbey was shut down in 1791, Charlotte returned to, let's call it the real world, moving back to her father's farm. The 23-year-old supplemented her father's meagre income by tutoring the local children. Charlotte developed something of a reputation as a skilled and caring teacher, beloved by her own pupils. But once she returned home, the dining table became a battlefield. Charlotte and her father would engage in endless heated arguments, during which she staunchly defended the revolutionary ideals against her father's conservative views. Eventually, Charlotte could take it no longer, and in June 1791 she went to live with an elderly relative based in Caen. This elderly relative had never met Charlotte before, but begrudgingly accepted to take her in. She must have later regretted the decision, as she immediately tried to marry her off to any Tom, Dick or Harry in the city. Charlotte would have approximately none of this, as her suitors paled in comparison to the idealised heroes that spoke directly to her from the pages of the book she'd read. Moreover, this relative frequented an environment supportive of an absolute monarchy, which only fueled Charlotte's stubborn, pro-constitutional tirades. Thus far, Charlotte's involvement with the revolution consisted almost exclusively of heated discussions against the provincial backdrop. But soon the threads of fate would extend towards her, dragging this fiery yet innocent Norman girl into the grinding cogs of history. In June 1793, Charlotte's life in the Cairn backwater was shaken to the core by the influx of a band of very argumentative neighbours. We've all been there. A group of about 20 members of Parliament had moved into the Hotel d'Intendance, very close to Charlotte's and her elderly relative's residence. These politicians belonged to a party known as the Girondins and had escaped Paris in haste after an insurrection had flared up on May 31st. Charlotte was, in a word, delighted to meet a group of such important revolutionaries and listened avidly to their discussions. The more time she spent with them, however, the more the ideals of revolution were shattered. The young Corday was well informed about the power politics within the revolutionary parliament, roughly split into two main parties, the Girondins and the Montagnards, known as the Jacobins. The latter were a altogether more radical faction who counted the notorious Maximilien Robespierre amongst their ranks. These were the guys who were the main proponents of just abolishing the monarchy, and they were all for the centralisation of the economy and civil service, and were inclined to violent action. On the other hand, Charlotte's new friends, the Girondins, were more moderate. They were ambivalent towards the elimination of the monarchy, advocated for economic liberalism, and opposed the centralisation of government. They supported violent action only if directed against external enemies. For example, they urged a declaration of war against Austria in April of 1792. After an initial position of strength, the Girondins had gradually lost credibility, as they were still in support of a constitutional monarchy, but Louis XVI committed a series of blunders, starting with a botched escape attempt in June 1791, which led to his eventual deposition and declaration of the Republic on September 21st, 1792. Despite the best efforts of the Girondins to save him, the king was eventually guillotined on January 21st, 1793. And that is a word that I do know how to pronounce. Thank you, Pokemon. A Montagnard delegate was a particularly vocal supporter of such measures, congratulating the executioners from the pages of his newspaper. His name was Jean-Paul Marat. Charlotte Corday learned about Jean-Paul Marat's misdeeds over the course of several meetings with Girondin refugees. They told her that after the events of September 1792, the Girondins saw Marat as a dangerous, radical figure and brought him to trial in April of 1793. But the tactic sort of backfired. Marat was acquitted and the Girondins' downfall from power accelerated yet further. Marat then instigated a series of vicious political attacks against the Girondins, which culminated with the insurrection of the 31st of May, 1793. A Parisian mob surrounded the parliament and demanded that 29 Girondin delegates be brought to trial. This is when most of them managed to escape the riots and eventually fled to Caen, befriending the young Charlotte Corday, the hero of today's story. The 24-year-old listened giddily to the Girondins' recollection of events, and their tales of persecution painted a very clear picture in her head. The Montagnards were corrupting the very essence of the revolution, replacing tyranny with worse tyranny, and the vilest of this clique of despots was the Jean-Paul Marat, a liar who spread injustice from the pages of his newspaper. During one of these meetings, she heard one of the Girondin delegates exclaim, and I quote, "Let Marat's head roll and the country will be saved." Corday couldn't agree more. On July 9th, Charlotte had made up her mind. Marat had to die, and die by her hand. She left Caen immediately, reaching Paris on the 11th, and she went to a sympathetic Girondin delegate, from which she learned that Jean-Paul Marat was now very seldom seen in public. It wasn't widely known, but he had contracted a very painful skin infection which forced him to take very long medicinal baths prepared by his wife, Simone of Rad. This was an annoying snag. Charlotte had intended to murder Marat in full view of the public, preferably while he was speaking in Parliament, but it was just a minor snag after all. The show had to go on, and killing a guy in his bathtub is still a pretty visual image that people are going to remember. July 13th, 1793 was a Sunday, and early in the morning, Charlotte took a stroll through Paris on a shopping trip like many French ladies do. She first bought a fashionable black hat decorated with a silk green ribbon. Then she stopped at a cutler's shop to purchase what she really needed, a big knife. Later in the day, she boarded a carriage and asked the driver to take her to the home of Jean-Paul Marat. Corday reached Marat's house at 11:30 in the morning, and as she climbed the stairs leading to the flats on the first floor, Charlotte was interrupted by Catherine, Simone's sister. Charlotte was told that Marat was simply too ill to receive visitors, and she had to return to her lodgings. While there, she had 2 notes dispatched to Marat claiming that she wanted to discuss sensitive information regarding an anti-Montagnard plot being hatched in Caen. She then prepared for her meeting with Marat. Corday called for a hairdresser, changed into an elegant dress, and finally tucked her knife, her birth certificate, and a letter addressed to the French people down the front of her undergarments. Too impatient to wait for a reply to her note, she called for another carriage, and by 7 in the evening, she was once again at Marat's house. This time, Simone blocked her way, resulting in a heated row. Charlotte protested loudly that she wanted to inform citizen Marat about the Girondin plots in Normandy, and the ruse worked. Marat called from his bath and asked Charlotte to sit next to his tub, which doubled as his writing desk. People don't know, yeah, he did a lot of his writing in his bath, and Marat would even say, it's a really great place because no one wants to meet with you in your bath unless you really insist upon it, so no one bothers me. Fair play. A Frenchman to the end, I suppose. Under Simone's watchful eye, Charlotte talked at length about the alleged plot, naming several actual Girondins along the way, names which Marat took careful note of. When Simone left the room to fetch a medicinal powder, Marat looked at the list of names and said, and I quote, "I will have them all guillotined in Paris." And it was that point that Charlotte Corday rose to her feet, drew her knife and plunged it into Marat's chest, just above the right collarbone. No, that's the left. Just above the right collarbone. She then grabbed the incriminating list and threw it into the bathtub, hoping that the water would destroy it, and with his dying breath, Marat howled for help. Simone promptly arrived, followed by Laurent Bass, an employee of Marat's. Charlotte did not offer any resistance. Nonetheless, Laurent hit her violently with a chair and then pinned her to the ground. It's not a steel chair, according to historical sources, but I really can't miss an opportunity to say, and then she came in with, "The steel chair!" A police commissioner, Citizen Goulard, soon arrived to formally arrest Charlotte. Corday calmly and bravely admitted to Goulard that she had killed Marat by her own hand with absolutely no outside help whatsoever. Interrogators were incredulous. Surely a young, well-bred woman was incapable of such an unspeakable act of cruelty and violence. She must have been manipulated by one or more male conspirators, possibly by a lover. Finally, in the dead of night, Charlotte was transferred to the Abbaye prison, barely escaping the clutches of a furious mob. She was kept in solitary confinement as authorities tried to make her confess that she must have been part of a Girondin conspiracy, preferably a much larger one with more people they could guillotine. Her interrogator was the president of the Revolutionary Tribunal, Jacques Montaigne. Again, Corday calmly confessed to her crime, admitted premeditation. Montaigne suspected that she had to have been helped by 2 Girondin accomplices, Deputy Duperrey and Bishop Fauché. In the magistrate's view, such an assassination could not have been conceived by, and I quote, "a person of her age and gender," to which Corday wryly replied, "It's easier to carry out such a project from one's own hatred, from that of others." The following day, the 15th of July, the angelic assassin was transferred to the conciergerie prison. As she awaited her trial, she wrote 2 letters. The first was a rather peculiar request addressed to the Committee of the General Safety, stating, "Since I only have a few moments to live, might I hope, citizens, that you will allow me to have my portrait painted. If you deign to attend to my request, I would ask that you send me tomorrow a painter of miniatures." The committee was headed by Robespierre, notoriously more interested in cutting off heads than having them portrayed, and he and his colleagues complied nonetheless, and an artist, Monsieur Monsieur Hauer was sent to the conciergerie. The second letter was addressed to her father, in which she asked for forgiveness, stating in part, "for disposing of my life without your permission." In this letter, Charlotte also made mention of her lawyer, Girondin deputy, and this is just a lot of French, so Louis Gustave Le Doucet, Count of Ponticoulon. But on the day of the trial, July 17th, Doucet did not show up. The public prosecutor, the Montagnard Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, had been tasked with summoning the defence lawyer via letter, but this message was delivered too late for Doucet to participate. Charlotte would not be without counsel, however. Her defence would have been taken up by a very famous lawyer at the time, Claude Chavac-Lagarde. And a curious parallel of history here, the same prosecutor and attorney would actually face each other in court some months later during the trial of Marie Antoinette. But getting back to Corday's case. Now, Chavac-Lagarde may have been a star lawyer, but there was really little he could do to defend Charlotte Corday. She had been caught in the act literally red-handed, and I've only just now realised what red-handed means, with, like, you know, blood on your hands, and had confessed several times to the murder. So during the trial, each deposition of the witnesses for prosecution were met by Corday's words, "It's true." Truly a nightmare for any lawyer. Finally, she admitted to the tribunal that anything was justified for the security of the nation. "I killed one man in order to save 1,000. And yeah, just having, like, you know, your client constantly shout "it's true" every time the prosecution says they did something probably didn't help with the jury. All her lawyer could really do then was look for extenuating circumstances, namely, and to quote, the exaltation of political fanaticism that had put the dagger into her hand. He, in this vein, asked the citizens of the jury to apply prudence and take into account this, and I quote once again, "moral consideration in the balance of justice." The trial started at 8 AM and was over by the early afternoon. The verdict, predictably, was a guilty one. The sentence, death by guillotine, to be carried out that very same day. At 6:30 PM, under a heavy rain, Charlotte Corday was taken to the Place de la Révolution, her hair now cut short and her elegant dress replaced by a simple red shirt. As she climbed the steps to the guillotine, the executioner Sanson stepped in front of her, hoping to hide the machine of death from her view. Charlotte ordered him to please step aside, stating, "Please, I have never seen a guillotine before, and I'm curious to know what it looks like." Moments later, the heavy blade had done its job, and I'm reminded here of, again, another curious historical parallel. When Marie Antoinette was killed, her reported last words were, "Excuse me," when she stepped on her executioner's toes on the way to the guillotine. Getting back, finally, to Charlotte Corday, one of Sanson's assistants, a man called Legros, had lifted Charlotte's head from the basket and slapped her cheeks as a last affront. The executioner and the crowd, moved by the dignity and courage she displayed till the literal very end, loudly threatened the man. Charlotte may have killed one of their leaders, but she had eventually earned their respects by simply being just so baller and cavalier about the whole thing. The angel of assassination had serenely accepted the ultimate consequence of her mission, but it's worth asking, was her mission a successful one? That note she threw into the bath, yeah, they fished that out almost immediately and got all the names off it, and one of them even commented after the fact when they were all tracked down and tried. She has killed us, but at least she has showed us how to die. On a larger scale, Jean-Paul Marat's death did prompt his fellow Montagnards to crack down hard on the remaining Girondins and other enemies of the revolution. Eventually, the reaction to the assassination, amongst other external and internal threats to the revolution, brought about the so-called Reign of Terror, a period of massacres and public executions which claimed as many as 27,000 lives. Corday had stated that she killed Marat to save thousands of lives, but tragically, as fate often likes to do, her deed had the exact opposite effect. And I hope everybody at home enjoyed this video, found it informative, educational, and entertaining. I certainly found the script to be all three of those things, and if you do agree, Arnoldo Teodrani's socials can be found below, as can my own if you want to follow me. You can also find our sister channels, Geographics and Top 10s, which I'm also the interim host of. But, as I always like to say to everybody at home, like, leave a like below if you like the video, a comment if you've got anything to say, any feedback, suggestions for future topics, and as always, subscribe for more, and have the day you all deserve. Cheers.